Hey everybody, this is just going to be a bit of a rant about the current state of video game visuals and performance, especially when it comes to PC. So as you can see, we have Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl here. This is obviously a widely beloved game despite being a broken mess. And we'll cover that when we get to the review, whenever that ends up happening. But this isn't just about Stalker 2, but Stalker 2 is a good way of showcasing what I'm talking about here. So, I've got the game here running on the Epic preset, which is the highest settings. Upscaling is turned off. It's at 1080p on my RTX 3080 12GB model. So I've got 12 gigs of VRAM. As you can see from the performance metrics over there on the left, it's getting about 80 to 90% of my GPU usage, or 80 to 90% GPU usage, when I'm just standing up here not really doing a whole lot. It does occasionally spike up to about 95, 96%, but it never goes out to 100. And it is not running well. So even just kind of standing here, it's at about 85% usage, and it's still not 60 FPS at 1080p on an RTX 3080. Now, I'm going to throw up an image of the game's system requirements and the frame rate targets, and you will see why this is a problem. The rest of my system, for reference, is a Ryzen 9 5900X and 64 gigs of RAM. I am, of course, running this on a very fast SSD, so that's not a problem either. So, performance is awful in this game. If I move down here, then the frame rate will go down to about 45, 40, somewhere around in there. And to make matters worse, the visuals do not justify the incredibly poor performance this game has. This looks like a game that could have come out on Xbox One and PS4. Yeah, it's running in Unreal Engine 5. Yeah, it has a few effects here and there that you would not see on a PS4 or Xbox One game, but for the vast majority of what you're looking at, this looks like it could have come out on Xbox One and PS4. And yet it runs this poorly. And to make matters worse, there are certain effects and just graphical quirks that make it look downright awful. And it's most noticeable on the foliage here. If I go over here and just try to zoom in, it's probably not going to show up all that well in the video because of YouTube compression. But if you look at this foliage here, and I'll take a few screenshots as well, so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I'll see if I can get an uncompressed video clip of what I'm talking about as well. And I'll link all that in the video description box. But the short version here is that everything looks fuzzy and heavily pixelated, and it just looks awful. Particularly when it comes to foliage, but it does also happen at the edges of shadows and things like that. So it just looks horrible. And I discovered something on trying to test for performance about what's going on there, but we'll get to that here in a moment. And just for the sake of argument, because I'm sure there will be some people who want to know what it's like, I'm going to set everything to the lowest possible settings. Once again, this is without running any kind of upscaling like DLSS. Now, first off, it has this horrible pop-in problem whenever you reload the settings and such. Now, the game looks terrible. Textures look awful. The effects look awful. It does run better, but we're still only getting, just standing up here where there's basically nothing being rendered, we're still only getting about 70 to 80 FPS. If I look up at the sky, it'll go up to 100 and something. But, If I go down here, 50s, it does run a bit better. Sometimes it'll even hit 60. But for the most part, we're still in the 40s and 50s on the lowest possible settings, and the pop-in is now horrendous. Now, if I step back here just a bit, notice that that tree has now disappeared, and whenever I aim down my sights to zoom in here, that tree just pops in. That is the kind of horrendous pop-in you get in this game. Not just on the lowest setting. It's also present on the max setting. In fact, I'll go ahead and show it here. Go back up to the epic setting here. And let it load everything in. But you'll see, it still happens even on the highest settings. And that is very jarring. Now, there will be some people out there who will say things like, oh, well, it's because you're running an RTX 3080. You need a 4090 or some other bullshit like that. No, I do not need a 4090. I especially do not need one because it will most likely burst into flame because they have faulty connectors. And that is a known problem with them. You can look it up yourself if you don't believe me. They actually do catch on fire. And my RTX 3080 is more than capable of running even something like this at 1080p. In fact, it is above the recommended specifications for running this thing at 1440p 60 FPS. I have a screenshot of the system requirements and recommended specs to show you exactly what I'm talking about here. Again, the rest of my systems are Ryzen 9 5900X, 64 gigs of RAM. And you can even see, when you look at the performance metrics here, that it's barely using my CPU at all. It is using my GPU a lot, but it's definitely not reaching the performance that they are saying it should reach at 1080p. So, this thing not being able to render at 60 FPS constantly at 1080p on an RTX 3080 12GB model is pathetic. It is downright pathetic. And the thing gets worse if you try to turn on DLSS. So we're going to start by turning on DLSS. And you will notice a few things immediately. Or you may or may not notice them actually because of YouTube video compression. First things I notice, the foliage no longer looks terrible. It doesn't have that horribly pixelated fuzzy look to it anymore. Everything in general now just looks blurry. It's like somebody smeared petroleum jelly over the screen. But notice that the performance isn't really any better. In fact, in some ways, it's a bit worse. There's now a bit of input delay that feels weird. Now, the input never really felt great in this game to begin with, but once you turn on the upscaler, it starts messing with the inputs even more. And if you even try to turn it to the ultra performance setting, now everything looks horrible, absolutely atrocious. It does hit 60 FPS, but it's barely creeping up to it now. And that input lag I mentioned is even worse now. But now you have absolutely horrendous ghosting on everything. It's most notable when I move, or most noticeable when I move past this post on the scaffolding here. You can really see it kicking in, where the upscaler just it just can't handle it. And if I turn everything down to the lowest possible settings and leave DLSS on here, it not only still looks atrocious, the performance gain is just barely even there. It is technically running above 60 FPS now. It's hitting 70, 75 at times here. But there's that horrible input feeling, and the ghosting is far worse on the lower settings. You can see it there. And everything looks horribly pixelated and blurry. And when you look at the shadows here, for example, they just look atrocious. So, the thing that I've found here is that my issue with the foliage there, and another issue that I forgot to mention here, was the everything is jagged. The anti-aliasing in this game just doesn't seem to work properly. And I found out that once you enable DLSS or some other kind of upscaler, it smooths out all the edges. So the jaggedness that apparently the game's anti-aliasing system is incapable of fixing is somehow fixed with DLSS and other upscalers. And the foliage looking terrible is fixed by it, but at the cost of making everything look blurry and awful. So what ended up happening here is that GSC Game World apparently couldn't be bothered to optimize the game properly. So they just shrugged and basically made DLSS a requirement to actually play the game at something vaguely resembling a playable frame rate. I'm going to bring it back up to the epic settings and turn off DLSS because I am tired of looking at this blurry, just awful mess. There's no way of playing this game that doesn't have issues, and it drives me nuts. But anyway, if I turn off DLSS, it has that horrible foliage problem. If I look up here, you may be able to notice it. I don't know how well it's showing up on the YouTube video because of the video compression. But everything has a jagged edge to it because the anti-aliasing isn't sufficient. If you turn on DLSS, it fixes that problem. It fixes the foliage problem, but again, at the cost of making everything look blurry and awful. And the performance gains from enabling upscalers are just not sufficient. And what we're seeing more and more from the industry in general, but especially from games running on Unreal Engine 5, is that they are designed to work with upscaling enabled. They don't even consider doing proper optimization so that just running the game at native resolution looks and runs like you would hope it would, like you would expect it would. Now they're just saying, no, we'll just throw upscaling techniques in there. That'll make it work, and that might work for console, where you absolutely need to squeeze every last bit of performance out of that hardware because it is outdated hardware. But on PC, that's just utterly idiotic. There is no reason to do that for PC. And with the recent announcements regarding the 5000 series cards from NVIDIA, one of the statistics they were pushing was that something like 80% of gamers, I think, are enabling DLSS now. Well, gee, I wonder why. It's almost like games are designed to run with it, and if you don't run DLSS, you get these horrible visual artifacts, you get these jagged edges, and, of course, the games run like complete dog shit because they're not optimized properly. Developers are using upscalers as a crutch, and it is pathetic. They just can't be bothered to optimize their games properly anymore, so they just shrug and say, they'll just run it with DLSS. It'll be fine. No, it's not fine. This is unacceptable. Especially for a game like Stalker 2, where they are charging $70 US for the standard edition, and over $100 for the gold edition, or whatever they're calling it, that includes the extra content that'll release later on down the line. You charge premium product prices, and you do not deliver a premium product. You deliver a product that is severely compromised. It's buggy, it's broken, it's unfinished, it doesn't run well. In the case of Stalker 2, it outright runs like shit. It's barely even playable. And that's just unacceptable. I am sick of seeing this crap from seemingly every new release, especially with Unreal Engine 5 games. It's not as much of a problem on Unreal Engine 4 because Unreal Engine 4 doesn't have things like Lumen. I mean, if you go, and another game I've been messing with recently is Ready or Not. That runs in Unreal Engine 4. If you run it in DirectX 11 mode, it doesn't run that well, but if you run it in DirectX 12 mode, it runs fine. It's just a bit less stable. I don't know what the problem is there, but anyway, point is, that game looks good, and it runs pretty well, and yet they have a fraction of the resources that a developer like GSC Game World has. And it's Unreal Engine 5 seems to be just a complete failure at this point. It doesn't even look that much better than Unreal Engine 4. I mean, sure, some of the lighting effects look a bit better, but you can't look at this overall and say, yeah, this is worth running at 40 FPS at 1080p. It's pathetic. Now, the merits and faults of the game itself, I'll leave that for the review. As I've mentioned before, I don't know when that's going to be. I'm going to be covering the original 3 Stalker games first in a Redux format, and that will all be in the same video. So I'll be making 2 videos covering the Stalker series. The first one will cover Shadow of Chernobyl, Clear Sky, and Call of Pripyat, and then the second video will be the review of this. So as for quality assessments of the games themselves, you'll just have to wait for those. Stay tuned. But I just wanted to rant about the current state of video game visuals and how everything seems to be just getting worse. Sure, the technology is improving. Technology is getting more and more advanced, but developers just aren't using it very well. They end up with just ugly messes like what you're seeing here. And the games run like shit. And the most important thing, especially for an action game like this, is performance. If the game doesn't run well, it's a compromised experience, and it's just unacceptable. You don't charge a premium product price and not deliver a premium product. I don't know why it is so hard for not just developers and publishers, but gamers themselves to understand this. They just seem to be shrugging this off, like, no, it's fine, just run it with an upscaler. No. Fuck your upscalers. It's a pathetic crutch for crappy developers to lean on. And I'm sick of it. I mean, you can make arguments for Stalker 2 specifically, because obviously GSC Game World went through hell to get this game released. I understand that, but the simple fact of the matter is, they released a broken, buggy, unfinished product and charged a premium price for it. And that is not acceptable. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you went through. If you don't deliver a finished product, don't act like it is. Don't charge a premium price for something that is clearly compromised. I mean, if it's not finished, release it as an early access game. Make sure people know what they're getting themselves into. Don't just act like it's done when you have not only these severe performance problems and glitches and such, but also systems like the A-Life system, which they heavily touted and as a major part of the experience, just straight up don't work at all. That whole feature just doesn't work. This game is straight up unfinished, broken, and buggy. And it runs like shit. And you can argue all you want whether you enjoy the game or not, that's fine. But the simple fact of the matter is that they released a broken, unfinished, buggy, poorly performing product, and that is not acceptable. For anybody. You rightly ream studios like CD Projekt Red for releasing a game like Cyberpunk 2077, horrendously unfinished, extremely buggy, very poorly performing, and yet you won't do the same for a developer like GSC Game World when it comes to Stalker. Because, you know, it's just an anomaly, Stalker. Don't insult everyone's intelligence with that crap. If they wanted to play in the AAA pond, then they need to be held to the same standards. Again, I'm not unsympathetic to them. I understand they went through hell to get this game released, but they should have just left it in the oven for longer. They should have actually finished it before they released it. But that's all I have to say about Stalker 2 specifically. When it comes to this whole trend of the visuals getting effectively worse and the game's running worse, I'm just going to say that the future of gaming looks downright bleak. I am not looking forward to more and more games getting released on Unreal Engine 5 and inevitably running like complete shit and having dramatically overinflated system requirements because the developers can't be bothered to optimize the game properly, and how everything's going to just start looking blurrier and blurrier because they demand you run everything with upscaling techniques just to get a vaguely acceptable frame rate even at a low resolution. I'm just sick of this crap already. I mean, I've had to put up with broken, bug-infested messes for years. I'm used to that. Having a release or two that every year, that doesn't bother me that much. I mean, obviously, when it comes to reviews, it's not acceptable, but in terms of that occurring every so often, that's not that big of a deal. But now that it's becoming more and more common, even for AAA games where they have plenty of resources and plenty of QA to work with, it's depressing. You know, a lot of people like to say that gaming is better than it's ever been, and it really isn't. Developers used to have to actually deliver finished products. They used to actually have to optimize their games properly. And now they can just shrug and say, no, we'll fix it with patches, and then they don't fix it with patches. Or they'll shrug and say, just run it with an upscaler, and that's fine. But it's not okay. It's disgusting, and I'm tired of seeing it. And it seems like that's only going to keep happening and keep getting worse as time goes on. Hopefully I get proven wrong on that. Hopefully developers finally get a clue and start actually optimizing their games properly, but considering what we've seen with pretty much every Unreal Engine 5 release so far, I'm not going to hold my breath on that. Maybe we'll see it with other engines. Frostbite. Actually, that's pretty much the only other engine that's being used right now, isn't it? Frostbite. There's Unreal Engine 5, and then there's Frostbite, and then, of course, indies are using things like Godot and Unity and all that. And they have to optimize their games somewhat. But anybody running Unreal Engine 5 just seems to be able to shrug and say, nah, just run it with an upscaler. It's fine. But no, it's not. I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.